In 1941, as the shadows of war stretched across the Pacific, Singapore stood as a beacon of British power in Southeast Asia. Known as the Gibraltar of the East, this island fortress was the cornerstone of the British Empire's defense strategy in the region. Its naval base, the largest outside Europe, was a testament to the might and ambition of a global empire that had once ruled the seas unchallenged. For decades, Singapore symbolized invulnerability, a gleaming outpost of colonial pride, and a crucial hub for trade and military operations. To the Allies, it was a bastion of hope. To the Japanese, it was an irresistible target. British leaders had long viewed Singapore as essential to securing their interests in Asia. From its strategic location at the tip of the Malay Peninsula, it controlled access to the Strait of Malacca, a vital artery for shipping and resources. Since the 1920s, Britain had poured vast sums into fortifying the island. Gigantic coastal guns, extensive bunkers, and heavily guarded defenses bristled along its shores, pointing seaward to deter an assault from the waves. However, the British plan had a critical flaw. It assumed an attack would come by sea. The jungles of Malaya, stretching to the north, were deemed impenetrable, a natural barrier no enemy would dare to traverse. The events of late 1941 would shatter these illusions. The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7th unleashed a tidal wave of aggression across the Pacific. In a matter of days, Japan's military machine swept through Thailand, the Philippines, and British-controlled Hong Kong with astonishing speed. Singapore, once considered an impenetrable fortress, suddenly found itself isolated, its myth of invulnerability crumbling under the weight of Japan's advances. Japanese forces, led by the brilliant yet ruthless General Tomoyuki Yamashita, now set their sights on what they viewed as the crown jewel of the British Empire in the East. The fall of Singapore would not only mark one of the greatest defeats in British military history, but also serve as a grim turning point in World War II. The scale of the loss, 130,000 troops captured, the largest surrender in British history, was devastating. For Britain, it was a moment of profound humiliation. For Japan, it was a demonstration of the effectiveness of their strategy, discipline, and technological superiority. In London, Winston Churchill had long warned of the vulnerability of the British Empire's eastern holdings. However, the magnitude of Singapore's collapse stunned even him. The fortress that was supposed to hold for months against a siege fell in a mere 70 days. In a somber speech to Parliament, Churchill called the loss the worst disaster and largest capitulation in British history. The shock reverberated far beyond Britain, shaking the confidence of allied nations and emboldening Japan as it marched further into Southeast Asia. The tragedy of Singapore lay not only in its swift fall, but in the false sense of security that preceded it. For years, British leaders and military planners clung to the belief that their fortifications were sufficient and their enemy incapable of mounting a credible attack. The Japanese, however, had carefully studied these assumptions, exploiting every weakness with precision. The illusion of invincibility, the steadfast belief in an outdated strategy, and the inability to adapt to the realities of modern warfare combined to seal Singapore's fate. As the world turned its eyes to the unfolding drama in Southeast Asia, one question loomed large. How could an empire that had once spanned the globe fail so catastrophically? In the chapters that follow, we will explore the events leading to Singapore's fall, the courage and folly of its defenders, and the lessons it holds for the conduct of war. We begin with the Japanese assault on the Malay Peninsula, a campaign that would redefine the boundaries of strategy and set the stage for the siege of Singapore. In the dense jungles of Malaya, the quiet of dawn was shattered on December 8, 1941, by the sound of Japanese guns. The attack on Pearl Harbor, just hours earlier, had already announced Japan's entrance into the war, but the assault on the British-controlled Malayan Peninsula was part of a broader strategy to dominate Southeast Asia. General Tomoyuki Yamashita, the man who would soon be known as the Tiger of Malaya, had meticulously crafted a bold plan to conquer Malaya and Singapore in a lightning campaign. His forces, though smaller than the British-led garrison, were disciplined, resourceful, and, most importantly, underestimated. Yamashita's strategy relied on speed, surprise, and an audacious push through the seemingly impenetrable jungles of Malaya. To the British, the idea of an attack from the north seemed improbable. The terrain was too harsh, and the infrastructure too underdeveloped. But Yamashita's forces adapted with remarkable ingenuity. They used bicycles to traverse jungle trails, enabling them to cover distances at a pace that bewildered their adversaries. The sound of these bicycles, the clatter of wheels and the crunch of gravel, became a harbinger of Japanese advances, as troops swiftly bypassed traditional strongholds to strike at weak points. In contrast, the British forces were unprepared for such an unconventional assault. Their defenses were oriented toward the sea, and their troops were ill-equipped for jungle warfare. General Arthur Percival, the commander of British forces in Malaya, was a capable administrator but lacked the battlefield experience to match Yamashita's aggressive tactics. His men, a mix of British, Indian, Australian, and local units, faced significant logistical and strategic challenges. Many had received little jungle training, and their weapons and equipment were poorly suited for the terrain. Moreover, the chain of command was plagued by indecision and a reluctance to adapt to the rapidly changing situation. The Japanese struck first at Kota Baru, a coastal town on Malaya's northeastern tip, in a daring amphibious landing. The defenders, comprising Indian troops and Australian airmen, fought valiantly but were quickly overwhelmed by the speed and coordination of the Japanese assault. While the British hoped the Malayan jungles would slow the enemy advance, they instead provided cover for Japanese infiltrators, who used stealth and superior tactics to outmaneuver the defenders. Reports of Japanese troops appearing seemingly out of nowhere sowed fear and confusion among the British ranks. As Yamashita's forces pushed southward, they demonstrated a masterful use of combined arms. Japanese bombers, flying from captured airfields, established air superiority early in the campaign. This dominance allowed them to conduct devastating attacks on British convoys and strongholds, further crippling the defenders' ability to regroup. The British Royal Air Force, RAF, hampered by outdated planes and insufficient numbers, struggled to counter the swift Japanese Zeros. By the end of the first week, the Japanese controlled much of northern Malaya and had begun targeting key railways and supply lines. One of Yamashita's greatest strengths was his ability to adapt. He identified weaknesses in British positions and exploited them with precision. British troops, spread thin across the peninsula, were forced into a series of retreats as their defensive lines crumbled under relentless Japanese pressure. The Japanese also used psychological tactics to great effect. Reports of atrocities against captured troops and civilians spread terror among the defenders, further eroding morale. Meanwhile, Yamashita's troops marched inexorably south, their bicycles rattling ominously through the jungle paths. General Percival's indecision proved costly during these critical early days. While his subordinates urged him to consolidate forces and launch counterattacks, he hesitated, fearing that such moves would leave key positions vulnerable. This reluctance allowed Yamashita to maintain the initiative. The Japanese momentum was unrelenting, and their ability to seize vital towns and infrastructure outpaced the British capacity to respond. By late December, the Japanese had captured Penang, an island city that served as a vital supply and communications hub for the British. The fall of Penang highlighted the dire state of the British defense. As Japanese planes strafed retreating Allied forces, civilians scrambled to evacuate on overcrowded ships, many of which were sunk by enemy bombers. The scenes of chaos and destruction foreshadowed the fate awaiting Singapore. Among the defenders, there were moments of remarkable courage. Indian soldiers of the 11th Infantry Division fought tenaciously at Kampar, holding off Japanese attacks for several days despite being heavily outnumbered. Their determination provided a glimmer of hope, but it was a brief respite. The relentless Japanese advance and their mastery of jungle warfare continued to expose the vulnerabilities of the British strategy. In the coming weeks, the Japanese would capture key towns such as Ipoh and Kuala Lumpur, tightening their grip on the peninsula. Yamashita's forces, though stretched thin, displayed remarkable discipline and efficiency. The fall of these strategic locations left the British forces increasingly isolated, their supply lines severed and their morale plummeting. Civilians, caught in the crossfire, bore the brunt of the escalating violence. Reports of massacres and looting spread fear throughout the region as Japanese troops solidified their reputation for brutality. Despite these challenges, some Allied forces attempted to regroup and mount a defense. Australian units, newly arrived in Malaya, sought to establish defensive positions at Moor and Segamet. However, their efforts were hampered by the lack of coordination with other Allied units and the overwhelming pressure of the Japanese assault. The British command, still reeling from the shock of the initial Japanese advances, struggled to formulate a cohesive strategy. As the new year dawned, the fate of Malaya seemed increasingly sealed. Yamashita's audacious strategy had outpaced the British defenders at every turn, leaving them scrambling to retreat toward their final stronghold, Singapore. The island fortress, once thought to be impervious, now loomed as the last line of defense in a campaign that had already shattered the myth of British invincibility in Asia. The fall of Singapore was no longer a question of if, but when. As the Japanese forces surged deeper into Malaya, the British defensive strategy began to unravel under the weight of Yamashita's relentless advance. The Battle of Gibraltar in mid-December 1941 would mark a critical turning point in the campaign, exposing the fragility of the British position and setting the stage for a catastrophic series of retreats. This confrontation, though brief, revealed the stark contrast in preparation, tactics, and morale between the two forces. The Japanese opened the battle with a coordinated assault that showcased their mastery of combined arms warfare. Tanks, artillery, and infantry worked in concert to overwhelm the British positions. Despite being outnumbered, the Japanese deployed superior tactics, exploiting gaps in the British lines and utilizing the cover of the jungle to conceal their movements. The defenders, comprising units of the Indian 11th Division under Major General David Murray Lyon, were unprepared for the scale and speed of the attack. The division's lack of anti-tank weaponry proved particularly devastating. Japanese tanks, rolling through the muddy trails with surprising efficiency, punched through the thin defensive lines with ease, leaving British infantry units vulnerable and exposed. The air war over Malaya further compounded the difficulties faced by the defenders. Japanese air superiority, established early in the campaign, gave them a decisive edge in both reconnaissance and ground support. The Mitsubishi A-6M0, a highly maneuverable and effective fighter plane, dominated the skies, easily outclassing the outdated Brewster Buffaloes of the Royal Air Force RAF. Japanese bombers conducted precision strikes on key infrastructure and troop positions, hampering the British ability to regroup. The loss of airfields to the advancing Japanese meant that the RAF was forced to retreat southward, leaving the ground forces without vital air cover. The defeat at Gibraltar had profound consequences. Murray Lyon, recognizing the untenable position, ordered a withdrawal to Guruan, but the retreat quickly devolved into chaos. Communication breakdowns and the rapid pace of the Japanese advance turned what could have been an orderly retreat into a rout. Troops abandoned heavy equipment and vehicles, which were often destroyed to prevent them from falling into enemy hands. The retreating forces also left behind large quantities of ammunition and supplies, further bolstering the Japanese war effort. As the British forces fell back, the Japanese pressed their advantage with remarkable tenacity. They exploited the region's extensive network of roads and railways, often capturing key points ahead of the retreating Allies. Their use of bicycles for troop transport allowed them to navigate the narrow jungle paths with incredible speed, a tactic that caught the British completely off guard. These bicycle blitzes became emblematic of the Japanese campaign, allowing their infantry to outpace Allied forces and secure critical objectives before defenses could be established. The human toll of the campaign was stark. Indian and Australian troops, fighting in unfamiliar and harsh conditions, bore the brunt of the Japanese assaults. At Kampar, a valiant defense by the Indian 6th Brigade managed to temporarily halt the Japanese advance during the New Year's Eve battle. The defenders utilized the terrain to their advantage, establishing strong points on the hills and inflicting heavy casualties on the Japanese attackers. For a brief moment, it seemed that the British forces might regain some semblance of control. However, the success was short-lived. Reinforcements failed to arrive in time, and the defenders were eventually forced to withdraw under intense pressure. The retreat to Kuala Lumpur marked another low point in the campaign. The fall of the Malayan capital on January 11, 1942, underscored the failure of British strategy. As Japanese forces marched into the city, they encountered minimal resistance. British and Commonwealth troops had been ordered to abandon the city, prioritizing the defense of Singapore. The decision to cede Kuala Lumpur without a fight demoralized both the troops and the civilian population. The Japanese quickly took advantage of the city's infrastructure, repurposing its airfields, railways, and supply depots to sustain their advance. For the civilians caught in the path of the Japanese onslaught, the experience was harrowing. Reports of atrocities, massacres, rapes, and the execution of prisoners spread terror among the population. These brutal tactics, intended to break the spirit of resistance, often had the desired effect. Refugees poured southward, seeking safety in Singapore, only to find the city increasingly overwhelmed by the influx. Despite the grim situation, acts of heroism and resistance continued to emerge. Australian troops of the 8th Division fought with remarkable courage at the Battle of Moore, inflicting heavy casualties on the Japanese despite being outflanked and outgunned. Their resistance delayed the Japanese advance long enough to allow other Allied units to regroup further south. However, these isolated successes could not stem the tide. By the end of January, the Allied forces had retreated across the Johor Strait to Singapore, leaving the entirety of the Malayan Peninsula in Japanese hands. The campaign's impact on British morale was devastating. The rapid fall of Malaya exposed critical flaws in British military planning and leadership. The assumption that the Japanese would struggle to advance through the jungles proved fatally incorrect. Moreover, the British failure to integrate their forces effectively, relying on a patchwork of Commonwealth troops with varying levels of training and equipment, highlighted the challenges of coordinating a multinational defense. General Yamashita's success in Malaya was not merely a product of superior strategy, but also of psychological warfare. His troops' ruthless efficiency and relentless momentum created an aura of invincibility that sapped Allied morale. Yamashita himself, a shrewd and charismatic leader, earned the respect of his men through his hands-on approach and unyielding determination. While his resources were limited, he maximized their impact through bold and decisive actions, earning the nickname the Tiger of Malaya. By early February, the stage was set for the final confrontation in Singapore. The once proud fortress, now teeming with refugees and battered troops, stood as a symbol of British resistance in the region. Yet the fall of Malaya had shattered the illusion of its impregnability. The Japanese victory in the Malayan campaign was not just a military triumph. It was a devastating blow to British prestige, one that would reverberate throughout the empire. The Allies now faced the grim reality of defending Singapore against an enemy that had proven unstoppable. The question was no longer whether Singapore could hold, but how long it could withstand the inevitable siege. As February 1942 began, Singapore braced for the inevitable siege. The once proud fortress, now the final Allied stronghold in Southeast Asia, was under no illusions about its precarious position. The fall of Malaya had left the island isolated, and the combined effects of a relentless Japanese advance, insufficient defenses, and mounting civilian chaos created an atmosphere of desperation. What had once been a symbol of British imperial might now stood on the brink of collapse. The island's defenses, despite years of planning and investment, were woefully inadequate for the task ahead. Singapore's formidable coastal artillery, designed to repel a naval invasion, remained pointed out to sea, leaving the northern approaches via the Johor Strait exposed. These massive guns, capable of firing shells weighing hundreds of pounds, were nearly useless against a land-based assault. Efforts to repurpose them to target Japanese positions on the mainland were hindered by their design and a lack of suitable ammunition. This miscalculation would prove to be one of many strategic errors that doomed the defense. General Arthur Percival, now faced with the monumental task of defending Singapore, found himself in an unenviable position. Commanding an army of approximately 85,000 troops, he was outmatched by General Tomoyuki Yamashita's battle-hardened force of 30,000 Japanese soldiers. Though Percival's numbers were greater, his troops were a mix of British, Indian, Australian, and local units, many of whom were exhausted, undertrained, or poorly equipped. The diversity of the forces also posed challenges in communication and coordination, further complicating efforts to organize an effective defense. On February 1st, Japanese artillery began shelling Singapore from positions across the Johor Strait. These barges targeted key infrastructure, including airfields, supply depots, and communication lines, inflicting significant damage. The shelling was relentless, creating a sense of dread among both the defenders and the civilian population. The situation was exacerbated by Japanese air raids, which devastated the island's already strained resources. The loss of Tenga Air Base and other key installations earlier in the campaign had left Singapore's skies undefended, allowing Japanese bombers to strike with impunity. For the civilian population, the situation was dire. Singapore, once a thriving metropolis, now faced a humanitarian crisis. The city's population had swelled to over 1 million as refugees poured in from Malaya, seeking safety from the Japanese advance. Food and water supplies were rapidly dwindling, and the destruction of key infrastructure made distribution nearly impossible. Panic spread as rumors of Japanese atrocities reached the island, further undermining morale. Civilians dug air raid shelters in backyards and parks, but these offered little comfort against the scale of destruction raining down from the skies. Despite the dire circumstances, there were moments of resilience and hope. British engineers worked tirelessly to repair damaged infrastructure, while volunteer brigades, composed of both locals and expatriates, helped distribute supplies and care for the wounded. These efforts, however, were not enough to offset the overwhelming challenges facing the island. Within the military leadership, tension was mounting. General Percival faced mounting criticism for his indecisiveness and lack of clear strategy. His leadership style, characterized by caution and a tendency to defer decisions, contrasted sharply with Yamashita's bold and aggressive approach. Percival's subordinates grew increasingly frustrated as opportunities to mount counterattacks were lost. Meanwhile, Yamashita continued to exploit British weaknesses, using psychological warfare to demoralize the defenders. His artillery barges and air raids were designed not only to inflict physical damage, but also to sow fear and confusion among the Allied forces. The Japanese also targeted the city's water supply, recognizing it as a critical vulnerability. Singapore relied heavily on reservoirs in Johor for fresh water, and Japanese shelling of these facilities disrupted the flow to the island. By early February, water rationing was imposed, further exacerbating the suffering of the civilian population. This strategic focus on infrastructure demonstrated Yamashita's understanding of the importance of logistics in modern warfare. Amid the chaos, there were instances of remarkable bravery. Indian soldiers of the 44th Indian Infantry Brigade fought valiantly to hold the line against Japanese advances on the mainland, buying precious time for the defenders to regroup. Australian units, though heavily outnumbered, conducted daring raids on Japanese artillery positions, disrupting their operations temporarily. These acts of heroism, however, were not enough to turn the tide. As the shelling intensified, the British command faced a grim reality. Singapore was not prepared for a prolonged siege. The island's supply lines were effectively cut off, and the lack of naval reinforcements made evacuation impossible. The Royal Navy, which had once been expected to defend Singapore, had been decimated earlier in the campaign. The loss of the battleships HMS Prince of Wales and HMS Repulse to Japanese air attacks off the coast of Malaya left the island without significant naval support. This absence underscored the broader failure of British strategic planning, which had underestimated the capabilities of the Japanese military. By February 7th, the Japanese had established firm control of the mainland and began preparing for the assault on Singapore itself. Yamashita, despite commanding a smaller force, remained confident in his ability to overcome the island's defenses. His troops were seasoned, disciplined, and well-equipped, in stark contrast to the beleaguered Allied forces. Moreover, Yamashita's use of deception, such as deploying fake tanks and troop movements to mislead the British, kept Percival and his staff guessing about the true direction of the attack. As the siege loomed, Singapore's defenders and civilians alike grappled with the weight of what was to come. The city's strategic significance had made it a target, but its defense now seemed increasingly untenable. The myth of Singapore as an impregnable fortress had been shattered, and the question of its survival hung heavily in the air. The fall of Singapore was no longer just a military event. It was a human tragedy unfolding in real time. On the evening of February 8, 1942, the first Japanese assault on Singapore began under the cover of darkness. From their positions across the Johor Strait, Japanese artillery and bombers unleashed a devastating barrage on the northern shore of the island. The thunder of explosions and the eerie glow of fires marked the start of a full-scale invasion. Civilians and soldiers alike huddled in makeshift shelters as the Japanese guns tore into defensive positions, roads, and supply depots. The psychological and physical toll of the relentless bombardment was immediate and overwhelming. General Tomoyuki Yamashita's strategy for crossing the Johor Strait reflected his characteristic audacity and tactical brilliance. Rather than mount a direct assault against Singapore's heavily defended coastal batteries, Yamashita directed his forces to strike west of the main fortifications, exploiting gaps in the British defensive line. Using a fleet of makeshift rubber boats and rafts, the Japanese soldiers paddled silently across the strait under cover of darkness, avoiding detection until they were perilously close to their objectives. By the time the defenders realized the scale of the assault, it was too late to mount an effective counterattack. The first wave of Japanese troops landed near Seremban Beach, on Singapore's western flank. The defenders, primarily Australian units of the 22nd Brigade, fought fiercely to repel the invaders, but were outnumbered and outmaneuvered. The Japanese, using infiltration tactics perfected during the Malayan campaign, bypassed strong points and attacked from unexpected directions. Under intense pressure, the Australian units were forced to fall back, ceding valuable ground to the advancing enemy. The coastal artillery batteries, a key component of Singapore's defenses, were effectively neutralized during the early stages of the assault. Despite their formidable size and firepower, these guns were designed to target ships at sea and were of limited use against land-based forces. Efforts to repurpose them for firing inland were hampered by a lack of suitable ammunition and technical constraints. This critical oversight left large sections of the island vulnerable to Japanese advances, allowing Yamashita's forces to establish beachheads with minimal resistance. As the Japanese consolidated their positions on the western shore, they began advancing toward the interior of the island. Their progress was swift, aided by a combination of overwhelming firepower and psychological warfare. Japanese troops used loudspeakers to broadcast recordings of screams and taunts, aiming to demoralize the defenders. They also launched propaganda leaflets into Allied positions, urging surrender and warning of the futility of resistance. These tactics, combined with the ferocity of the assault, shattered the already fragile morale of many Allied troops. General Arthur Percival, now faced with a rapidly deteriorating situation, struggled to coordinate an effective response. His headquarters at Fort Canning was inundated with conflicting reports and pleas for reinforcements. Percival's cautious nature and indecision proved costly as he hesitated to commit his reserves, fearing that the Japanese might launch a secondary attack elsewhere on the island. This reluctance allowed Yamashita to maintain the initiative, exploiting gaps in the defensive line and forcing the Allies into a series of disjointed retreats. One of the most critical moments of the battle occurred on February 10th, when Japanese forces captured Bukit Timah, a vital supply depot and high ground that provided a strategic vantage point over much of the island. The fall of Bukit Timah not only deprived the Allies of essential supplies, but also gave the Japanese a commanding position from which to direct further operations. The defenders mounted desperate counterattacks to retake the area, but these efforts were repelled with heavy losses. The situation grew increasingly dire as the Japanese advanced toward the city center. By February 11th, they had reached the outskirts of the urban area, where fighting became even more brutal. The narrow streets and dense buildings of Singapore provided some opportunities for the defenders to establish strongpoints, but the Japanese adapted quickly, using flamethrowers, grenades, and close-quarters combat to clear out resistance. Civilians were caught in the crossfire, further compounding the humanitarian crisis that had gripped the city. The loss of Singapore's water supply was a critical turning point in the battle. Yamashita's forces, recognizing the importance of this resource, targeted the reservoirs and pumping stations that supplied the island's population. By mid-February, the main waterworks at Mac Ritchie Reservoir had fallen under Japanese control, leaving the city with only a limited reserve of potable water. This development devastated both civilian morale and the defenders' ability to sustain their resistance. Thirst and dehydration became as pressing a threat as the Japanese artillery shells raining down on the city. Despite the grim circumstances, there were instances of extraordinary bravery and resilience among the defenders. The Malay Regiment, a unit composed of local soldiers, distinguished itself in a heroic stand at Pasir Panjang. Outnumbered and outgunned, the regiment held its position against relentless Japanese attacks, inflicting significant casualties before being overrun. Their courage became a symbol of defiance and sacrifice, even as the broader campaign spiraled toward defeat. By February 13th, it was clear that Singapore's defenses were collapsing. Japanese troops had penetrated the city's outer defenses and were advancing on all fronts. The Allied forces, now reduced to a disorganized and exhausted remnant, struggled to hold the line. Communication and coordination had broken down, and many units were cut off from reinforcements or resupply. The once vibrant city of Singapore had been transformed into a battlefield, its streets littered with rubble and its skyline darkened by smoke. Amid this chaos, General Yamashita issued an ultimatum to the Allied command: surrender or face complete annihilation. The message, delivered with characteristic bluntness, left little room for negotiation. Yamashita's gambit was as much psychological as it was tactical. He understood that the defenders were on the brink of collapse and that further resistance would only prolong the suffering of the civilian population. His demand for surrender was not merely a show of strength, but a calculated move to force the Allies into an untenable position. As Percival and his staff convened to discuss their options, the weight of the situation became impossible to ignore. The fall of Singapore was no longer a question of if, but when. The defenders had fought valiantly against overwhelming odds, but the combination of strategic miscalculations, resource shortages, and the sheer determination of the Japanese forces had sealed their fate. The final days of the battle were marked by desperation and devastation, as the defenders prepared for what they knew would be their last stand. For the civilians of Singapore, the horrors of war were compounded by the uncertainty of what lay ahead under Japanese occupation. The once proud fortress had become a symbol of Allied failure, its fall a testament to the brutal realities of modern warfare. As the Japanese tightened their grip on Singapore, the city descended into chaos. By February 13th, General Tomoyuki Yamashita's forces had effectively severed the island into isolated pockets of resistance. His strategy, characterized by surgical precision and relentless pressure, aimed to exploit the psychological and logistical collapse of the British defenders. Despite their numerical advantage, the Allied forces faced disarray, dwindling supplies and mounting casualties, pushing Singapore closer to its inevitable fall. The Japanese approach to the siege was as innovative as it was brutal. Yamashita divided his forces into three key groups, each tasked with specific objectives that would fracture the already overstretched British defenses. One group advanced through the western sector, targeting the heart of the city's industrial and transportation hubs. Another struck toward the east, aiming to capture the remaining airstrips and water facilities. The final contingent infiltrated the densely populated urban core, engaging in street-by-street combat that devastated civilian infrastructure. This division of forces mirrored Yamashita's overarching strategy: isolate, overwhelm, and conquer. While the British clung to their defensive lines, the Japanese moved with speed and agility, bypassing strong points and striking at vulnerable supply lines. This approach disoriented Allied commanders, who struggled to anticipate the enemy's next move. General Arthur Percival, caught between conflicting advice from his subordinates, found himself increasingly paralyzed by indecision. In the streets of Singapore, the fighting grew more desperate by the hour. Japanese troops, experienced in urban warfare, adapted quickly to the labyrinthine streets and tightly packed buildings. Armed with flamethrowers, grenades, and bayonets, they cleared strong points with ruthless efficiency. Civilians, caught in the crossfire, suffered immensely. Whole neighborhoods were reduced to rubble, and makeshift hospitals overflowed with the wounded. Food and medical supplies became scarce, leaving both soldiers and civilians to endure unspeakable conditions. One of the most harrowing aspects of the siege was the collapse of Singapore's humanitarian infrastructure. The influx of refugees from Malaya had already strained the city's resources to the breaking point. Now, with water supplies cut and supply lines severed, starvation and disease loomed as deadly threats. Civilian volunteers worked tirelessly to distribute what little remained, but their efforts were no match for the scale of the crisis. Panic spread as rumors of Japanese atrocities filtered through the city, further eroding morale. Amid this chaos, there were moments of remarkable heroism. Allied units, though battered and outnumbered, mounted desperate counterattacks to slow the Japanese advance. The Indian 8th Brigade, stationed near Kranji, staged a valiant last stand against overwhelming odds, delaying the enemy's progress and allowing civilians in the area to evacuate. Similarly, Australian troops conducted nighttime raids on Japanese artillery positions, disrupting their bombardments and buying precious time for the defenders. Despite these acts of courage, the Allied position grew increasingly untenable. On February 14th, Japanese forces launched a concentrated assault on the city's southern sector, targeting the key strong points of Pasir Panjang and the Alexander Barracks. The Malay Regiment, tasked with defending Pasir Panjang, fought with extraordinary determination, holding their ground against repeated assaults. Their resistance became a symbol of defiance, but it came at a terrible cost. Outnumbered and outgunned, the regiment suffered catastrophic losses before the position was overrun. The fall of Alexander Barracks highlighted the brutality of the conflict. Japanese troops, enraged by the unexpected resistance, conducted a massacre of wounded soldiers and medical personnel in the barracks hospital. This atrocity sent shockwaves through the Allied command, underscoring the consequences of further resistance. For many soldiers, the prospect of capture now carried the specter of torture or execution, further sapping their will to fight. As the Japanese advanced deeper into the city, General Percival faced mounting pressure to make a decision. His subordinates urged him to launch a counteroffensive to reclaim lost territory, but the odds were insurmountable. The defenders were exhausted, their ammunition nearly depleted, and their supply lines irreparably severed. The city's water reserves were almost exhausted, leaving both soldiers and civilians on the brink of dehydration. Yamashita, aware of the dire state of the British forces, intensified his psychological campaign. He ordered his artillery to fire incendiary shells into the city's heart, setting buildings ablaze and creating a spectacle of destruction visible from miles away. Propaganda leaflets rained down on the defenders, emphasizing the futility of their resistance and promising humane treatment to those who surrendered. These tactics, coupled with the relentless bombardment, broke the already fragile morale of many Allied units. By February 15th, the situation was untenable. Japanese troops had breached the final defensive lines, and the city's remaining defenders were isolated and out of options. Percival, recognizing the futility of further resistance, convened a council of war at Fort Canning. His officers, though divided on the wisdom of surrender, acknowledged the humanitarian catastrophe that would result from continued fighting. With over 1 million civilians trapped in the city, the risk of mass casualties weighed heavily on the decision. That afternoon, Percival sent envoys to Yamashita's headquarters to negotiate terms of surrender. The Japanese general, ever conscious of his image, demanded an unconditional surrender to be signed at the Ford Motor Factory in Bukit-Timah. The meeting, conducted under the watchful eyes of Japanese soldiers, was a humiliating spectacle for the British delegation. Percival, pale and visibly shaken, signed the documents that ceded Singapore to the Japanese, marking the largest capitulation in British military history. The surrender of Singapore was met with shock and disbelief across the Allied world. For Winston Churchill, the loss was a personal and political blow. He had once declared that Singapore must be held at all costs, yet the reality of its fall underscored the limits of British power in the face of Japan's relentless expansion. In London, newspapers decried the failure as a national disgrace, while the British public grappled with the implications of the empire's vulnerability. In Singapore, the aftermath of the surrender was immediate and devastating. Japanese forces moved swiftly to consolidate their control, rounding up prisoners of war and enforcing martial law. Civilians, many of whom had hoped for a reprieve from the violence, now faced the harsh reality of occupation. For the defenders who had fought so valiantly, the end of the siege brought no solace, only the grim uncertainty of life under enemy rule. The fall of Singapore was more than a military defeat. It was a turning point in the history of the Second World War. It shattered the myth of British invincibility in Asia and emboldened Japan's ambitions in the region. Yet even in defeat, the courage and resilience of those who defended the city stood as a testament to the human spirit in the face of overwhelming odds. The inevitability of surrender loomed over Singapore by the evening of February 14, 1942. The British command, battered and outmaneuvered, faced the unrelenting pressure of General Yamashita's forces. As the city burned and its defenders dwindled, the decision to capitulate became less a matter of choice and more a grim acceptance of reality. This chapter of the story captures the harrowing moments leading to the capitulation, the tense negotiations, and the aftermath of what became a defining humiliation for the British Empire. Yamashita's strategy was as psychological as it was tactical. By now, he had earned the moniker Tiger of Malaya, a testament to his bold and unorthodox approach. On February 14th, he ordered his artillery to intensify the bombardment of Singapore's key infrastructure, targeting water reservoirs, power stations, and supply depots. Each explosion reverberated not just through the city's collapsing defenses, but also through the morale of its defenders. The message was clear: resistance would only prolong suffering. The Japanese also capitalized on fear. Yamashita's propaganda leaflets, dropped over British positions, promised humane treatment to those who surrendered, but hinted at devastating consequences for continued defiance. These leaflets, combined with the visible suffering of civilians caught in the crossfire, weighed heavily on General Percival's already strained resolve. Reports of massacres, like the one at Alexander Barracks, where Japanese soldiers slaughtered patients and staff, spread quickly, magnifying the psychological toll. In Fort Canning, Percival convened a final council of war with his senior officers. The once confident commander now faced a room filled with exhaustion, defeat, and conflicting opinions. Some officers advocated for a desperate counterattack, arguing that the city's honor demanded a fight to the bitter end. Others pointed to the humanitarian catastrophe unfolding in the streets, where over 1 million civilians lack water, food, and medical care. Percival, known for his methodical but indecisive nature, struggled to reconcile these opposing views. Ultimately, The sheer weight of the civilian crisis and the collapse of military logistics pushed him toward the path of surrender. Yamashita, meanwhile, played his role as a master negotiator. Despite the overwhelming Japanese advantage, he sought to project the image of a commander barely holding his forces together. His goal was to secure an immediate and unconditional surrender without resorting to prolonged urban combat, which could exhaust his resources. This approach was not only pragmatic, but also served to magnify the psychological blow to the British. By February 15th, Yamashita's demands were clear: unconditional surrender or total destruction. As the British delegation approached the Ford Motor Factory in Bukit Timah, the site chosen for surrender negotiations, the scene was heavy with symbolism. The factory, repurposed as Yamashita's headquarters, underscored the rapid and humiliating collapse of British power. The delegation, led by Percival, entered a room dominated by Japanese officers whose demeanor oscillated between restrained triumph and cold formality. The negotiations were brief and one-sided. Yamashita demanded complete capitulation, with no concessions for the British forces or civilians. Percival, visibly pale and fatigued, had no leverage to counter these terms. The Act of Surrender, signed on the afternoon of February 15, 1942, was a moment of profound humiliation. For Percival, it marked the end of a campaign fraught with miscalculations and unrelenting pressure. For the British Empire, it was the largest surrender of its forces in history, with over 80,000 troops becoming prisoners of war. The fall of Singapore was not just a military defeat, but a symbolic one, shattering the myth of British supremacy in Asia and emboldening Japan's ambitions across the Pacific. The reaction in London was swift and scathing. Winston Churchill, who had once declared Singapore an impenetrable fortress, now faced the grim reality of its loss. In a somber address to Parliament, he called the fall the worst disaster and largest capitulation in British history. The British public, already weary from the war, expressed a mixture of shock, anger, and despair. Churchill ordered a full inquiry into the campaign, seeking to understand how such a catastrophe could have occurred. For the Allied forces, the loss of Singapore was a stark wake-up call. The assumption of Japanese inferiority, a belief rooted in racial prejudice and outdated intelligence, had been shattered. The campaign highlighted critical flaws in British strategy, from the underestimation of Japan's capabilities to the failure to adapt to jungle warfare. It also exposed the limits of British power in the face of a determined and resourceful enemy. In Singapore, the aftermath of surrender was immediate and harrowing. Japanese forces wasted no time consolidating their control, rounding up Allied soldiers and civilian officials. The prisoners, many of whom were already malnourished and wounded, faced brutal treatment in Japanese internment camps. Civilians, who had hoped for an end to their suffering, now faced the harsh realities of occupation. The fall of Singapore also marked a turning point in Japan's expansion. With the city under their control, the Japanese gained a strategic foothold in Southeast Asia, allowing them to threaten the Dutch East Indies and Australia. For Yamashita, the victory solidified his reputation as one of Japan's most brilliant commanders, though his later career would be marred by controversies and eventual trial for war crimes. In the broader context of the Second World War, the fall of Singapore served as a grim reminder of the high stakes and brutal realities of the conflict. It underscored the need for Allied unity, innovation, and adaptability in the face of a formidable enemy. Though the loss was a devastating blow, it also galvanized efforts to reclaim the region and ultimately turn the tide of the war. As the Union Jack was lowered over Singapore, Japanese forces moved swiftly to consolidate their hold on the city and enforce a brutal regime that would redefine life for its inhabitants. The Japanese occupation of Singapore, officially renamed Sinan II, meaning Light of the South, marked a harrowing period of oppression, violence, and survival. The Japanese victory ushered in a reign of fear. The military administration, led by Lieutenant General Tomoyuki Yamashita, wasted no time in asserting dominance. Japanese troops paraded triumphantly through the city's streets, their presence a stark reminder of the empire's newfound control over Southeast Asia. For the residents of Singapore, the occupiers' arrival was the beginning of a nightmarish transformation. One of the most infamous episodes of the occupation was the Sook Ching massacre. Derived from a Chinese term meaning purge through cleansing, this operation targeted Chinese males suspected of anti-Japanese sentiment or connections to resistance movements. Using intelligence gathered through informants, the Japanese systematically rounded up thousands of men, herding them into screening centers across the city. Those deemed undesirable were taken to remote locations and executed. Estimates of the death toll vary, but it is believed that between 25,000 and 50,000 Chinese men were killed. The massacre left an indelible scar on Singapore's Chinese community, fostering a deep-seated animosity toward the occupiers. The harshness of Japanese rule extended far beyond mass killings. The Japanese imposed strict regulations, forcing civilians to bow to soldiers, banning the use of the English language, and requiring Japanese language education. Food and essential goods were heavily rationed, leading to widespread malnutrition and suffering. The local economy, already strained by the war, collapsed under Japanese policies that prioritized the extraction of resources for their war effort. For the average Singaporean, daily life became a struggle for survival. Resistance movements, though fragmented and under constant threat, began to take shape. Covert networks of anti-Japanese fighters, often supported by Allied intelligence, worked tirelessly to disrupt the occupiers' control. Among these groups were the Malayan People's Anti-Japanese Army, MPAJA, and various clandestine organizations formed by Chinese residents. While their impact on the Japanese war machine was limited, their efforts symbolized a refusal to submit to tyranny. For prisoners of war, life under Japanese control was equally bleak. The Changi prison, originally built to house a few hundred inmates, became a holding facility for thousands of Allied soldiers and civilian internees. Conditions were appalling. Overcrowding, disease, and malnutrition were rampant. Prisoners were frequently subjected to forced labor, with many sent to work on the notorious Thai-Burma Railway, a project infamous for its grueling conditions and high death toll. The railway, dubbed the Death Railway, claimed the lives of tens of thousands of prisoners and local laborers, a testament to the inhumanity of Japanese wartime practices. The suffering extended to the city's infrastructure. Japanese forces looted valuable resources, dismantling industrial equipment, and shipping it back to Japan to fuel their war effort. The ports, once a bustling hub of trade, now served as a conduit for the extraction of goods and materials. Public services ground to a halt, and the once proud city descended into a shadow of its former self. Despite the overwhelming hardships, moments of resilience shone through. Local communities banded together to share scarce resources, provide mutual aid, and maintain cultural traditions in defiance of their occupiers. Underground schools, secret religious gatherings, and covert charity networks helped preserve a sense of identity and hope amidst the chaos. These acts of solidarity underscored the indomitable spirit of Singapore's people. The Allied response to Japanese occupation was complicated by the broader context of the war. Resources were stretched thin, with the United States and Britain focusing on campaigns in Europe and the Pacific. However, intelligence-gathering efforts in Southeast Asia intensified. The British Special Operations Executive SOE, in collaboration with local resistance fighters, conducted reconnaissance and sabotage missions aimed at weakening Japanese control. These operations, while limited in scope, demonstrated the importance of multinational cooperation in countering Axis advances. As the tide of the war began to turn against Japan in 1944, signs of cracks in their administration of Singapore became evident. Allied air raids targeted strategic installations, disrupting supply lines and sowing confusion among Japanese forces. The deteriorating situation on the home front further weakened their ability to maintain control over occupied territories. For Singaporeans, these developments provided a glimmer of hope that liberation might not be far off. The Japanese occupation of Singapore was more than a dark chapter in its history. It was a crucible of suffering and endurance. The events of these years shaped the collective memory of the nation, instilling a determination never to fall victim to such oppression again. For those who lived through it, the occupation was a time of unspeakable hardship, but also a testament to the human capacity for resilience and defiance in the face of unimaginable adversity. The fall of Singapore marked not only a turning point in the Pacific theater of World War II, but also a devastating reflection on the strategic failures and underestimated challenges faced by the British Empire. As historians and military experts dissect the series of events leading to this catastrophic loss, key lessons emerge that continue to influence military doctrine and geopolitical strategies. One of the most glaring failures was the underestimation of the Japanese military. British officials and commanders, influenced by racial prejudices and outdated intelligence, dismissed the capabilities of Japanese soldiers, labeling them as inferior in tactics, training, and equipment. This flawed perception ignored the reality of Japan's modernized military strategies, its exceptional adaptation to tropical warfare, and its relentless discipline. The Japanese Army's successful use of bicycles for rapid advancement, mastery of jungle terrain, and surprise amphibious operations exposed the British command's ignorance and over-reliance on outdated colonial arrogance. The defensive strategies employed in Singapore also revealed critical lapses in foresight and preparation. The British focus on coastal fortifications, based on the assumption of a seaward attack, left the northern approach through Malaya vulnerable. The decision to heavily fortify the coastline with massive artillery, only to see these defenses rendered ineffective against an overland assault, became a symbol of strategic misjudgment. Military analysts later emphasized the importance of flexible defenses and the ability to adapt to evolving threats, lessons that resonate in modern military planning. Poor communication and disjointed leadership further compounded the British defeat. General Arthur Percival's indecisiveness and hesitancy in decision-making were emblematic of a broader issue within the Allied command structure in Southeast Asia. His failure to unite diverse forces under a coherent strategy and reluctance to launch preemptive counterattacks allowed Japanese forces to seize the initiative. In contrast, General Tomoyuki Yamashita's boldness and calculated risks showcased the power of decisive leadership even when resources were limited. The role of military alliances, or the lack thereof, was another critical factor in Singapore's fall. Despite the contributions of Australian, Indian, and local forces, coordination among these groups was inadequate. Cultural and logistical barriers hindered effective collaboration, while the absence of a unified Allied front in the region left individual units vulnerable to Japanese advances. This highlighted the necessity of fostering international military cooperation, a principle that became central to post-war alliances such as NATO and the ANZUS Pact. The fall of Singapore also triggered a re-evaluation of Britain's colonial policies in Southeast Asia. The loss revealed the fragility of colonial rule and the growing resentment among local populations toward imperial powers. The Japanese exploited anti-colonial sentiments, portraying themselves as liberators rather than conquerors, a narrative that resonated with some local groups, even as Japan's brutal occupation practices belied such claims. This shift in perspective laid the groundwork for post-war independence movements across the region, from Malaya to Indonesia and beyond. Another key lesson from Singapore was the strategic significance of air superiority and logistical support. The British inability to match Japan's air power or protect key supply lines undermined their defensive efforts. Modern warfare underscored the need for integrated air, land, and sea operations, a concept that became central to military strategies in subsequent decades. The human cost of the fall of Singapore cannot be overstated. Beyond the loss of life and suffering during the occupation, the event shattered the myth of British invincibility. Winston Churchill himself described it as the worst disaster and largest capitulation in British history. The psychological impact extended beyond Southeast Asia, shaking the confidence of Allied forces and emboldening Axis powers. However, it also served as a wake-up call. prompting critical reforms and innovations in military strategy. In the aftermath of the war, efforts to memorialize the tragedy of Singapore's fall have emphasized the importance of learning from history. Museums, historical sites, and educational programs continue to explore the complex factors that led to this pivotal moment. By examining the mistakes, sacrifices, and resilience of those involved, contemporary leaders and citizens alike are reminded of the enduring value of adaptability, unity, and vigilance in the face of adversity. The lessons of Singapore's fall are not confined to military history. They resonate across disciplines, offering insights into leadership, cultural understanding, and the necessity of confronting biases that can cloud judgment. As a reminder of the devastating consequences of underestimation and division, the events of February 1942 remain a powerful cautionary tale for future generations. The fall of Singapore stands as one of the most defining and harrowing episodes of World War II. Its legacy resonates not only in military circles, but also in the collective consciousness of the nations and peoples who experience its profound impact. Beyond the strategic and tactical lessons, it is a testament to human resilience, the devastating costs of war, and the indomitable spirit of those who endured unimaginable hardships. For many, the fall of Singapore symbolized a seismic shift in global power dynamics. No longer was the British Empire viewed as invulnerable. The Gibraltar of the East, long touted as an impenetrable stronghold, had fallen swiftly and dramatically. This event underscored the vulnerability of even the most fortified defenses when they are undermined by outdated strategies, misjudged threats, and a failure to adapt to changing realities. In retrospect, Singapore's fall became a stark warning. Complacency in the face of evolving challenges leads to disaster. Amidst this catastrophe, stories of heroism and humanity emerged. Soldiers from across the Commonwealth, Indians, Australians, and Malaysians, fought valiantly despite overwhelming odds, insufficient resources, and poor leadership. Civilians, too, displayed remarkable courage as they coped with bombings, starvation, and the terror of Japanese occupation. Their sacrifices are etched into history, serving as a poignant reminder of the costs borne by individuals during global conflicts. The memory of the fall has shaped the way Singaporeans view their history and identity. Following the war, the trauma of occupation and the realization of British fallibility fueled the drive for self-determination. Singapore's journey from a British colony to an independent nation was marked by a collective determination to ensure such a tragedy would never occur again. The city-state's eventual transformation into a thriving, resilient, and globally connected nation is a testament to the resolve and ingenuity of its people. The lessons from Singapore's fall extend far beyond Southeast Asia. For military strategists, it highlighted the critical importance of intelligence, adaptability, and unity of command. The underestimation of Japanese forces, rooted in racial prejudice, proved to be a costly error, demonstrating the dangers of arrogance and assumptions in warfare. The necessity of integrated defenses, where land, sea, and air forces operate cohesively, became a cornerstone of post-war military doctrine. On a global scale, the fall of Singapore accelerated the decline of colonial empires. The British defeat undermined the legitimacy of imperial rule, particularly in Asia, where nationalist movements gained momentum. Japan's brief domination of the region, while brutal, exposed the fragility of Western control, paving the way for a wave of decolonization in the post-war years. Nations like India, Malaysia, and Indonesia would soon emerge from the shadow of colonialism, driven by aspirations for independence and self-governance. The human dimension of the fall also offers profound lessons. The resilience of those who survived, soldiers in captivity, civilians under occupation, and resistance fighters, reveals the extraordinary capacity of individuals to endure and overcome adversity. Their stories of survival, resistance, and recovery are a source of inspiration, reminding us of the strength that can emerge even in the darkest times. Efforts to commemorate the fall of Singapore ensure that its lessons are not forgotten. Monuments, museums, and educational programs serve to honor those who suffered and sacrificed while fostering an understanding of the complexities of history. These spaces encourage reflection on the cost of conflict, the value of peace, and the need to confront and learn from past mistakes. In the decades since the war, Singapore's remarkable recovery has become a symbol of hope and renewal. Its strategic location, once the cause of its vulnerability, has been transformed into a strength. Today, Singapore stands as a global hub of commerce, innovation, and diplomacy, a living testament to the power of resilience, unity, and forward thinking. As we reflect on the fall of Singapore, it is crucial to remember the people at its heart, the soldiers who fought, the civilians who suffered, and the leaders who struggled with monumental decisions were all part of a larger human story. Their experiences teach us not only about the cost of war, but also about the courage and humanity that endure in its wake. The fall of Singapore is more than a historical event. It is a powerful reminder of the need for vigilance, adaptability, and the pursuit of peace. Its lessons remain relevant in a world still grappling with conflict, division, and change. By understanding its history, we honor those who lived it and draw strength from their example to navigate the challenges of the present and future.